Well, let's go ahead and get started. It's time to roll. Again, good morning and welcome to the CIB's very first webinar. This is Bruce Baker speaking, and it's great to be with you this morning. As this is our very first ever webinar hosted by the CIB, the Center for Integrity in Business. And our intent is that we employ our faith and dive into our faith in ever deeper ways in the course of business and technology. So it's fitting that this morning's topic, dealing with big data, gives us a chance to do that, and that we're using these new technologies to get together. I call this a truth seeker's guide to big data because I mean to invoke the idea of a biblical faith as a truth seeker's posture towards the world. And when we approach these new technologies, I like to approach it from that posture of faith. I like to think about it theologically. I like to ask, how do we interpret this reality and these new events in light of the biblical witness? We immediately encounter worldview issues. This is the VP of Google Plus telling us that Google Plus gives you the opportunity to be yourself and gives Google that common understanding of who you are, which makes me wonder, just how is Google giving me the opportunity to be who I am? I kind of thought I was already doing that. And why does Google want to own a common understanding of who we all are? Well, what we discern in statements like this is an inherent and relentless reductionism, perhaps. Now, no matter how well-intentioned this motive is, I'm sure it is, and I can acknowledge and agree with Mark Zuckerberg when he says that the engineers at Facebook are idealistic and they just want to serve the common good. I imagine that's true, and it does serve the common good in wonderful ways. Well as that is, there does remain implicit in this sort of language a sort of implicit reductionism, and I think this gets revealed when we start to encounter this mindset in which people are represented as data sets. And these data sets can be manipulated and monetized. In our mental space, somehow, in our worldview map, somehow there's a tendency for us to start to look at others and to treat people, quite often faceless, anonymous people, as data sets to be manipulated and monetized. And I just start to wonder, where do we see this show up in terms of morality and ethics of business? And typically, we know this typically boils down to ever more sophisticated methodologies to drive sales. Well, let me just start off right here at the outset. It's good to just remind ourselves there's nothing new under the sun. This has been standard operating procedure in business for at least a century. And we've all grown up, every one of us has grown up in a consumer world. And that's standard. I'm not questioning the necessity to be good and clever at marketing and advertising. I take that for granted. What I'm looking to are the deeper, broader issues of how new data analytics might affect our views about humanity and interpersonal relationships. Because it's here that we will stumble across the moral, ethical issues which need attention. So, what has changed are the opportunities both to serve one another and to manipulate one another, depending on how we take advantage of the new emerging technologies. So let's try this. In the next few minutes, what I hope to accomplish is to look at this with fresh eyes from a biblical perspective and ask how a theological understanding of the issues of big data might help us to shape our technology and our business practices in ways that contribute to human dignity and human flourishing rather than detract from them. Let's take, for example, this idea. Many of us are familiar with wearable technology. The Fitbit is probably the best-selling. Shine is another product. There are about 20 of these products out in the market right now. There are also biophysical sensors that can monitor blood chemistry, heart rate. Essentially, every metabolic function can be monitored by a micro device and can be provided real-time data. Now, let's pair this up with our cell phone technology, constant surveillance, Wi-Fi, etc. Let's pair that up with artificial intelligence. Perhaps we start to invoke some of the not so far out in the future stuff from the movie Her, where we have a guy, a psychotic individual, falling in love with a computer operating system. Stupid idea, but yet nonetheless it does expose the potential wherein people start to digitize even their relationships. How much feedback do we want, and where does it become useful, and where does it become not so useful? Nature, the leading science journal, has pointed out that there are 6 billion mobile phones in use, and over 85% of the world's population has access to a mobile signal. Quote, we've really never had a technology other than human observation that is as pervasively deployed in the world. It's also estimated that over 90% of people that we would categorize as digital natives sleep with their cell phones. The cell phone is constantly with the person near their body. We also have ubiquitous surveillance going on in stores. Retail shops can employ not just buying habits, but even facial recognition. And employing facial recognition, also microsensors can be deployed now to pick up variations in body temperature, heart rate, breathing rate. Facial expressions can be read. Combine this with ubiquitous surveillance, and you have mind-boggling opportunities to use and manipulate people's personal data. And then let's combine that with the idea that people are basically just code anyway. Again, it goes to a mindset that if you could just understand the code and unravel the code of a person's DNA, you can have a biophysical control over them as well as all these other mechanisms. And you can see the possibilities are just endless here, for better and worse. And a lot of it is really better, clearly better. Some of you may be familiar with MapKibera. Here's an idea that's currently allowing people who have never had a citizenship or any personal control over their locality now actually have control and a citizenship and a sense of identity, an ability to protect one another, an ability to serve one another, an ability to help each other find out where water is, an ability to find out where kids can be in a classroom setting, which is happening in the slums. Amazing good is coming out of things like this. And lest you think this is only in the slums of Nairobi, the same type of work is also going on in the United States. Well, McKinsey has done an estimate that you take this all together, you add it up what the impact on business is in our data-driven culture, and you realize that there are something like 1.5 million, there's a shortage of 1.5 million data literate managers right now. There's also a shortage of 140 to 190,000 deep analytical quantitative technologists. Now, sitting where I sit at the university and teaching mostly in the Graduate School of Business with MBAs and MIS students, I wonder, what does this mean for our data-driven education? How do we prepare our technologists and managers to go into this brave new world and do so in a way that has a solid biblical foundation and morality? It's not just a matter of learning the technology and turning out excellent coders. It's also a matter of looking at this through the eyes of relationship and asking ourselves where these things have impact on human dignity and human relationships. I've done a lot of talking. I want to pause just very shortly here and take a quick look at the message board and find out if there's anything we should dialogue with right now before I go on into the biblical theological look at this. Tom, what are you showing? Should we continue, or do you want to? Okay, I'm going to continue for the moment. Now, what I'm going to do in this next segment is begin to get into a theological look at some of these issues. I'm going to begin with sort of this classical economic theory. If you go back to economics of about 150 years ago, you can see that this idea of homo economicus is developing because economics is becoming a quantitative science for the first time ever in human history, divorced from a theological understanding of reality. For the first time ever, economics becomes something that we try to treat as a science rather than as an application of philosophy and theological understandings of human good. The idea that is if we could just model human beings as rational economic decision makers, we can then apply mathematical methods to our economics. And wonderful good has come out of that, as we all know. Microeconomics, macroeconomics, and etc. are wonderful tools. They're required knowledge for anyone in business. But if you start to look at the influence this has on our conception of applying big data to manipulate people, I wonder where that might lead us, because let me look at this quote. Mainstream economics have forsaken too many colors of economics and have been over-obsessed with the black and white cult of homo economicus, which ignores issues of good and evil. We have created a self-inflicted blindness, a blindness to the most important driving forces of human actions. Well, and it's interesting that the recent Nobel Prize winner in economics, Schiller, has essentially pointed out the same thing and pointed out that the economic models fail at the point at which they try to be descriptions of human behavior. That it's not just a matter of irrationality which lies outside the purview of the model. There's actually something more fundamental at work which lies outside the purview of mathematics, period. I want to look at the drivers of this mindset which looks at people in a digital way. Obviously, we all know what we're talking about. Big data is a driver that can potentially drive us into this sort of worldview. Social networks is a factor that amplifies this exponentially. As social networks have grown exponentially, perhaps no longer growing exponentially, but still growing billions of connections per year, this amplifies the potential to manipulate the people as data sets. And then let's add in neuroscience, which keeps getting better and better at trying to understand how people do make decisions, and also to apply brain science, brain scans, biophysical, chemical factors, genomic factors into this. So we can start to incorporate a person's genome into an understanding of how they make decisions, in addition to all their other habits which have been under surveillance. And the next thing you know, we can come up with a pretty good model about how people are going to behave, and it's going to have predictive value in the marketplace. It absolutely is. So that's why we need to take very seriously how we're going to use that predictive value and what sort of assumptions we're going to read into it. The assumptions perhaps are the most pernicious part of it. These things can be used for good, but we need to question our assumptions. Now, as an example of that, I'm going to just quote Mark Zuckerberg here. This is from his letter to investors at the IPO of Facebook, published in his IPO offering. And he's addressing the sort of bad taste in the mouth that the word hacker has given people. And he says, the word hacker has an unfairly negative connotation from being portrayed in the media as people who break into computers. Hackers would rather just prototype something and see how it works. There's a hacker mantra that you'll hear a lot around Facebook offices: code wins arguments. Well, having been a hacker myself, and still in other ways a hack, I know that hacking is good because I know that you can turn out code quickly, and that's very important. You got to do that. Again, that's not what I'm questioning here. What I'm questioning are the sort of underlying mindset that might influence some of the decisions that we make about how we use that data. If we say that code wins argument, does that mean to imply that other modes of reasoning are subservient to code? I hope not, because that's not the source of what it means to be human. And I hope that's not where this leads. So in order to now look at a theological understanding of how to address these issues, I'm going to teach you a new word. And this word comes from a compound word of theos, which is the Greek word for God. It's the New Testament word for God, theos, and the New Testament Greek word for human, anthropos. And so the new word I want to teach you this morning is combining these two to make a new word, which is theanthropic, combining theos and anthropos. And what we arrive at is theanthropic. Why? Because this is the Trinitarian understanding of what it means to be a human being. It means to be in Christ. It means that God is human in the sense of being Jesus of Nazareth as a human being, as a God-man. And it means that when we are in Christ, that is our truest understanding of human dignity. And so the word that has been coined to express this is theanthropic. So what I'm going to do now is apply a theanthropic affirmation to the issues of big data ethics. And I'm going to argue that big data ethics should be based upon a theanthropic affirmation of humanity. Let me give you that in a quick definition. The source of being for humans is revealed in the incarnation. This unique valuation of humanity in the form of God's self-revelation lends significance to human dignity, far surpassing any conceivable dignity obtainable through any other starting point. If you want to talk about human dignity, please, you don't need to talk about legal rights or diversity or education. Those are good things. Those are essential things. God created those things. But the starting point is in God. The starting point is in God's self-revelation. That's the basis for human dignity that all people stem from. So you end up with not this. We do not have God as a data-driven construct, or we do not have people as a data-driven construct. It's the other way around. All right, so we have 4 theanthropic movements. So I'm going to give you these 4 theanthropic movements, and then I'm going to close with some practical steps that we can all take in business. So here we go, 4 theanthropic movements. You with me? We're going to do some heavy theology now. First, people are concrete persons. They are not abstractions. A data set is an abstraction. It never represents the person. Never, ever. I don't care how big you make it. It never represents the person. So the first theanthropic movement is in the direction of treating people as concrete persons, individuals. So first is to rescue human nature from abstraction. A theanthropic understanding will not permit the real person to be dealt with in any sense other than as a concrete person. Abstractions, on the other hand, are amenable to manipulation by algorithms and rationalization. Abstractions are generalizations and thus lead into one or another ethos based in general principles. Such treatment of human persons at its core is inadmissible and leads into unethical directions. We know this through the light of theanthropic understanding. If we were to suggest a reformation of the hacker way, for example, then we would want to recognize that algorithms which lump individuals together as data sets to be categorized and analyzed give priority to the pecuniary interest of the business, and thus do not necessarily yield an ethical good for the customer. If we want to deal with the ethical good of the customer, we're going to have to be approaching this from another direction. We're going to have to be evaluating this on the basis of service rendered to and the flourishing intended for the real specific and concrete individual person being affected. Now again, I know I'm not saying anything new right there, but I do think that the context forces us to pay better attention to the ways in which we might absent-mindedly fail to do that. Second, I want us to move in the direction of ontic encounter. Data leads us in the opposite direction. Ontic encounter is that real incarnational face-to-face sort of encounter. And that is the affirmation. That's the intra-Trinitarian communion sort of affirmation of what it means to be a human being. It means to be a person formed into the shape of ethical relationship. And an ethos like the hacker way misses the mark here by presuming to establish relationships at a distance. Algorithms operating on data sets do not afford ontic encounter. The unfortunate implication of this distance is that it insulates moral agents from immediate concern for the impact of their actions upon other persons. Psychological studies have been done verifying this. If you want to create a situation in which a person might be treated unethically or immorally, what you need to do, therefore, is to create distance between them, create psychological distance between them. What greater psychological distance is there than to convey human beings' presence as avatars on a screen who might be 10,000 miles away from you under your surveillance by a joystick. If you want to get distance from someone, treat them as a data set. Treat them as a dot on your screen. In business, we don't have to do it that way. Third, self-realization. Homo faber would be the Latin way of saying understanding the human being as by what they do, by what they make. And this has always been a sort of psychological path towards self-enlightenment, self-realization, productivity theory, psychological theories that are based on enhancing self-esteem, looking at what you accomplish. Data allows you to look at people by what they accomplish. It looks by what they by their behavior, right? It's not looking into what's going on inside them. It's not looking into their state of virtue. It's not looking into the state of their soul. It's not looking into their relationships at a deep level. It's merely looking at the observational data. That's different from the relational identity in the Imago Dei, which is entirely based on the relationship of love. So you end up with here, on the one instance, a tendency for people to present themselves as avatars. I mean, look at when we go to Facebook, we only put stuff up there that we want people to see, right? We only put stuff up there that makes us look good. We create an avatar, basically. That's not who we are. And if we start to think that's who the other people are, we're looking at them, we've fooled ourselves. Our real identity is going to be operating at a much deeper level. What this does is it moves the pressure of interpretation in terms of interpretation of worldview-based issues. It tends to move in a direction of replacing relationships with transactions. Now, from a business point of view, this means that value resides in the power to monetize a relationship. Well, that very simply turns persons into commodities. We see this in such rubrics as the Net Promoter Score, a measure of the potential profit a business may expect to glean from any given customer's buying habits and from their socioeconomic metrics. From the individual's point of view, value lies in what one can achieve or acquire. I'd like to quote one of my favorite theologians, Eberhard Jungel, there in saying that this is basically, it's a pretty good approximation of sin. If you want to start defining ourselves as what we do or what we're capable of achieving, we're basically defining ourselves on the basis of sin. Sin, simply put, he says, is the hopeless drive to self-realization. Among the worst human failures is the desire to realize oneself alone through one's good acts, through one's righteous action, whether it be only legalistic or even moral. And the fourth movement is discovering when and where our use of the technology begins to feel a little bit more like exploitation than it does grace or caritas. It's treating persons as objects to be used rather than as subjects of mysteriously divine and transcendent worth. And I think we all have a sense, we know that's true, and yet I'm surprised every time I catch myself doing it, every time I catch myself treating another person as a means to my own ends. And I think that by empowering myself with these data technologies, I increase my capacity to do that, honestly. And it's just something I want to be aware of. It's something I want my students to be aware of so that when they face those decisions, they make those decisions out of a view of how their business is bestowing grace upon their customer and grace upon society. An ethos inspired by the goal of monetization moves in precisely the opposite direction. Monetization uses the other person as an entity from which to extract value. That's why, as a Facebook user, I'm not a Facebook customer. What I am is a Facebook asset, which I have given to them, rather than as a divinely significant person for whom self-sacrifice and caritas are the properly ethical acts. In other words, I'd say monetization looks through the wrong end of the telescope. It seeks to take from rather than give to. Good business is all about giving value. So, such an ethos results in financial transactions which are extractive rather than additive in their intention. Well, In conclusion on this theanthropic movement, I would simply say that we've been reflecting on the questions: what happens when our understanding of human nature goes digital? What happens to our ideas about the integrity of economic behavior when human nature becomes reinterpreted through the lens of new digital technology? I'm going to close now with offering some guidance and what I hope to be some practical advice for all of us who deal with these technologies in business. Common sense, wisdom, I hope, biblical-based wisdom, let's hope, is to focus on relationships with real persons. To mine not just for that secret manipulative practice, but to mine for the hidden assumptions that you've built into your algorithm, because every algorithm you build is based on assumptions you have made about the people affected. You have made assumptions about why they do things. You've made assumptions about who they are. You've made assumptions about why they behave that way. You've made assumptions about their motives. I want to question those assumptions. Next, I want to ask who is being served. Let's keep ourselves honest on the straight playing field of always asking this question and not merely presuming that by increasing sales we have done a better job of serving someone. And give people access and control. A lot of the moral issues can be dealt with nicely by being careful to give people control over their data, giving people control over how they're being used. They can opt in and out. Now, let me close with saying, don't be creepy. Have you ever run into a situation that seemed creepy? Well, you know why. Creepy, here's my definition of creepiness in big data. Creepiness is what happens when a level of intimacy has been presumed which is inappropriate. It's when someone has used more data than you thought they were using to do something that you didn't really ask them to do. And so let's just be sensitive to that. Practical steps. What practical steps can we take? And this will be my final slide, and then we'll stop again for some dialogue. First, let's take a cue from the pharmaceutical drug testing business. They never do anything without forming an IRB, an internal review board. Now, the corner coffee shop is beginning to look more like a drug testing research project every day, because it knows more about the subjects in its lab every day. Not to get too silly, but you can see that all the personal information is leading us in the direction of dealing with so much personal data that it might not be a bad idea for companies that are heavily reliant upon big data to form an internal review board. An internal review board, why not get insiders and outsiders, communities, representatives, users? Why not get users, ethicists, a pastor on an internal review board to review your practices? Why not? Where's the harm in it? It can only help. De-identification is another important practice in drug testing, for example, and any type of medical test. You want to de-identify either through encryption, one-way encryption systems, technologies, so that the data cannot be reattached to someone's personal identity. We can employ some of the same practices in any data-driven technology if we make the effort. Next, I want us to set the bar high. I want to be the type of business that gets out there and lets my competitors and partners and lets the world know how I'm using this data. And I want to set the bar high on ethical standards. And I want to force the rest of the industry to do the same thing. Claim the high moral ground. Next, that means that we're going to have to collaborate with third parties. You can't do this on our own. There's no way we can sit back and dream up the best way to be the most ethical user of data all by ourselves. We're going to have to collaborate with third-party interest groups. Next, let's publish a statement of how we practice data analytics internally. My company ought to have one of those. Next, I need clear responsibility from the top. Somebody's got to own responsibility for this. That's what makes it moral. You all have been a wonderful audience, and I'm going to stop right here. I'm going to look at the comments, and I'm going to check in with Tom and figure out if we want to do some dialogue at this point. One question had to do with practical steps. I hope that this last slide here has helped to do that. How would you sell these metrics to a company that doesn't necessarily affirm faith commitments? Great question. Great question. And my experience is that it's not that hard to do. You obviously avoid the biblical language. I'm not going to go in there quoting scripture like this, for example. But, you know, if you tell people love your neighbor as yourself, they get it. They don't feel preached at. People accept that. And if you start to explain, the other thing you do is make the story personal. Tell a personal story about how this particular use of data has affected someone, and they'll get the point, because the truth of this interpersonal relationship is true of all of us. And what we need to do is personalize it. Once we get the ethical discussion back on the ground of personal relationships again, we're back on the right solid ground where we can deal with the ethics. As long as we keep it out there in the abstract and the data discussion only, it's harder to do that. You know what happened in the it's an infamous story now as to what happened at Target when a teenage girl's father started receiving literature in the mail from Target advertising baby products. And you know how annoyed he was. He called up Target. He managed to eventually get through to some sort of sales management. And they checked into it and were very apologetic. It turns out his teenage daughter was pregnant, and he didn't know that. He found out from Target because their data tracking was pretty good. That's one example. That's an example. At that point, it became personal. Up to then, there was no problem with that data tracking. The data tracking only becomes a problem when it gets personal and a real human being has a real problem. So we need to stay in touch with the people. Okay, this is a great comment. This is curious because doesn't de-identification work against your first movement, abstractions, as opposed to concrete persons? It works by protecting the concrete person. That was my point. It works by protecting the concrete person. It works by stopping the point was not that, I mean, you're exactly right. Mathematically, you're exactly right to say that what we're doing by de-identification is we're creating anonymity so that we can use the data in an ethical fashion. Quite right. That's exactly what it does. It creates anonymity so that you can use the data in an ethical fashion. The reason I wanted us to think about that is because I think when we do that, it's helping to protect the concrete person. It's helping to protect their personal, real identity. That was the point I was trying to make there. That was a very good comment. Let me see. What other comments do we have? Riley, did you have one? No. I see another one coming in, and I'll just keep glancing over here at the message board. Where's that? Oh, it said test, and I didn't realize it was a comment. Okay, are we throwing the baby out with the bath? The scripture and psychology both provide categories of generalization which allow us to communicate. For sure, a person is not characterized by the category, but the category is still useful. Sure, and I think that goes back to what I just said about de-identification. If we can think of smart ways to make generalizations and use those in ways that serve the community, absolutely right. Yes, indeed, I agree. Again, it's not because I'm saying that that's an unfruitful practice. I think what I was suggesting is that we not let the assumptions of the category then be imposed upon the individual. That's where we start to run into ethical issues. I think that's the point I was trying to make. Here's another comment. Is it okay if I just read this? Okay. So I'm on the board of a company called Crochet Kids, where every product is signed by the person who made it. And right, that's personal, isn't it? And the customer is invited to dialogue with that person. Oh, wow, look at that. Here's an example. I should keep reading, but it says, a large part of our sales and all of our advertising is web-based. Can you recommend other companies that I can look at for best practices? Well, I'm going to add Crochet Kids to my list. Thanks for that, Scott. I think that's a beautiful example of what I'm talking about. Just by doing that, you have inculcated within your company a mindset that keeps everybody in that company in touch with the personal connection. You've come up with a way to do that. It doesn't cost a lot. And my guess is that by enhancing the spirituality of the very job they're doing, they're actually doing a better job. It's a win-win virtuous cycle, and I love it. I love to hear that example. I wish I had more examples like that. WestJet, the Canadian jet company, is an up-and-comer, and they're doing very similar things. They are finding all kinds of creative ways to get their people in all different jobs in touch with customers and funding their people to be out doing that while they're on the payroll, while they're on the clock, in other words. There's another example. I'm sure I wish I had more at the tip of my tongue. Let's see. Here's another comment. One other practical step would be to properly staff customer service. Wow. Have you seen the recent studies of that? The more I saw one fascinating study that just came out. I'm going to have to look it up because I don't have the quote for you at my fingertips, but I'll follow up with you if you want. They looked at stores that had invested more money than their competitors, retail stores, more money than their competitors in terms of putting more trained people, more training and more people on the sales floor. And they have reaped very clear profitable returns compared to their competitors. But let me continue your comment. Your comment says, seems like the trend is to have all customer service be self-serve. Yeah, Google has no way to get in touch, etc. This may hurt margins, but it prioritizes the Ontic encounter, or at least voice-to-voice, person-to-person, plus treating people as concrete persons. Yeah, I completely agree. And the study I just cited, I think, is proof of it. Yes, thank you. Excellent point. I'm just pausing for a moment. There may be another question or two coming in. And by the way, you all, this is the one regret I have about this webinar is that I'm not in Ontic encounter with you right now. I hope you're laughing at me for not practicing what I'm preaching. I hope you are. I can't hear you. That's the problem. I want to hear your laughter. There's the people in the room with me, at least. I want you to know that. There's 4 people in the room with me, so they're laughing at me. Yeah, here comes another question. Okay. Yeah, because this was our first test ride with this webinar, we decided to do it the way that we were certain would work, and we never turned on the two-directional audience feedback, so we're going to try that next time. There is another question coming in that says that we ought to talk more about the tension between person to person and categories. Okay, good point. I think the first step we've done, at least, which is being aware that there's a tension, and I think that alone is helpful. I think that gets us, you know what it does? I think it gets us to ask the right questions. And I think in ethics, as an ethics teacher, so often I realize that it's a lot more about asking the right questions than it is about walking in the room knowing all the answers. And I think you're quite right to point out there's a tension there. Daniel Kahneman's work helps here. Thank you. That's a good reference. Kahneman, known for many things, one of which is a best-selling book, Fast Thinking, Slow Thinking. Looks like I'm going to stay on the line another couple of minutes. There's still some more typing going on out there. Yeah. Oh, I also want to let you know that we did record this session, and the CIB will be posting a link to it. And we certainly hope that this has been fruitful. We'd love to get your feedback. Please help the CIB learn how to do this better and better all the time. Our mission is to be inculcating, promoting, encouraging spiritual Christian faith in business and throughout our society. So please help us to get better at spreading those messages. quotation. Oh, okay. Titus 1:12-13. Thank you, Al. John Terrell, the director of CIB, is here with me. John, was there anything else you'd like us to add before we sign off?
It's 10:45.
Okay. We've used up our allotted time, so I want to thank you again for your participation. I look forward to an opportunity to be an OnTech encounter with you. My email address, I'd love to hear from you, is bakerb, that's BAKERB, at spu.edu. Thanks a lot. Stay in touch. Oh, 2 more people are typing? Okay, I'll stay on for them. Thank you too. Thanks, Scott. I'm so glad that you signed on. Chimeng, thank you. I'm in a relationship with you now. You said thank you. Love it. Awesome. I hope to meet you soon. Bye-bye.